thanks for joining me. Today I want to share a bit of my design process and make some fun new characters for a solo Call of Cthulhu game I'm going to play. I think tabletops are obviously most fun with a group, but solo play offers a fun way to generate writing and art prompts too, so I do that from time to time. It's really more like daydreaming with dice, I guess, than a traditional campaign, but it's still pretty fun to do. Right, so because I'm playing a game with these two characters and they're not just regular OCs, before I started designing them, I rolled up their stats and traits so that I can play proper Call of Cthulhu with them. These stats gave me a starting point to go off of with the designs. For the first character, I got a large, extremely well-educated guy who's fairly smart. My first thought was to make a professor, a pretty quintessential type of character in Lovecraft's stories, upon which Call of Cthulhu is based. I also rolled for his trait that he's a gambler and a risk taker, so I wanted him to feel a little bit cool at the same time. He is definitely a nerd, but he's got more going on than just his books, so I give him kind of a, I guess almost like smarmy kind of expression on his face behind his glasses. As for his outfit, I looked up some references, but I do have a fairly good visual library of different eras of men's suits in my head, as just kind of like a history nerd. For the 1920s, men's suits were longer than they are now and often had a sort of scoop or cutaway at the front that you don't really see anymore. I'm not sure what the actual term for that would be, but it's something that I've noticed. I'm not really a fashion historian, but I just keep my eyes peeled mostly, I guess. Another thing is that the lapels in the 1920s are not particularly remarkable in any way. For example, you see in the 30s and 40s generally smaller lapels as people had less money for fabric and then less resources because of the war, and then they get bigger again after World War II. However, the lapels on suits in the 20s are longer than they would be in a modern suit, but are less expressive than some of the ones from the 1800s where they could be quite pointy or have kind of a notch in them as well. Now, onto his niece. I decided it would be nice if the two characters were related so that they already had a reason to be spending time together right as I started playing. For her, I rolled extremely well for all of her stats across the board. She is also very well educated. She's actually smarter than her uncle, and she is extremely beautiful and charming. There was, through the end of the 1800s onward, an idea of the new or modern woman. Sometimes this was used in a derogatory manner, but the new woman was capable, mobile, and wanted greater rights and freedoms. This idea pops up in novels like Dracula and also kind of coincides with the rise in popularity of bicycles as a means of transportation. To be able to bike provided women with a method of transportation that greatly increased their independence. At the same time, it also meant that they had to wear pants. You can't really bike very well in a skirt, and it's not particularly modest either. You see something similar happen with teenagers in cars in the 1950s, where they get this greater sense of independence because of their increased mobility away from their parents. Of course, the modern woman was also conceptualized as being at once promiscuous and beautiful, but also as a cranky, old, man-hating suffragette or spinster. Our character here, she isn't really any of these things in particular. Instead, she wishes to be a student at university, and while women were beginning to be allowed to attend, the scope of their studies was very limited in the 1920s. Luckily for her, though, her uncle is a professor and has pulled some strings for her time and time again. She's also from a wealthy part of their family and has been able to afford her own tutors and equipment to pursue her interests in biology and chemistry. However, as a bit of an odd duck, and being as devoted to her studies as she is still unmarried despite having just turned 30. She doesn't really care about this fact, but some of the other people and non-player characters that they run into over the course of their campaign may care about this. As for her clothes, I don't have as much to say. My knowledge of historical women's clothing is even smaller than my knowledge about men's, and I also have a particular dislike of the 1920s silhouette. I imagine that on a moving, living person, some of these dresses may have been quite appealing in the way they moved and looked, but it's not really my favorite. Regardless, I got together some references, and I did my best to put together an outfit for her that I found appealing. I kind of put her in a little bit of a suit. I thought that it would make her look a little bit more collegiate, and I think that it was something that she would like to wear since it's more practical and will keep her a little bit warmer while she's outside looking at animals and things, since she's a biologist. So moving on to inking and coloring these designs that I've sketched out, I tried a different brush for inking them this time. I think in other artists' work, I admire a lot of things, and one of them is these beautiful, thin little lines that some artists can make with their work. There's so many artists who do this well, and I'm so envious of them, but I just feel like I can never really get it to work when I try to implement it in my own work. Thicker line art or line art that has a lot of line variation can be more energetic, and it's also something that I love to see, so I shouldn't really be complaining, but I think I will just have to continue to work on getting more confident with thinner lines, because realistically, it's a skill issue on my part that I can't get that kind of line work to work in my own pieces. I need to work on control and speed and overall line quality. But, sometimes it's fun to just play with a big brush with lots of variations. And obviously, lots of my favorite comic book artists and other artists do that too. And I think that it can add a lot of life to the work. I'm kind of at a place with my art right now where I'm trying not to take too much from any one of my inspirations, but rather to see what commonalities are between all of them across the board, so that I might be able to incorporate those things into my own art. And so far, I think it has been going pretty well, but I just can't quite seem to hack those very, very thin, delicate, beautiful lines, and it is really something that I'm going to have to keep working on, and it's kind of exciting. I like inking. It's a fun process, so as much as it is something I have to work on, it's not as if it's going to be a pain to have to work on it. After inking, we get to move on to color. Color is, of course, an important part of design, and it can signify a lot of things. It can show which characters belong together and which are opposed, even when done in subtle ways. It can also indicate material, class, all kinds of different things. However, color isn't really something that I'm very good at, I don't think. For the 1920s, I'm lucky that I can get away with a sort of brown tweed for a professor, and I can carry that into her skirt as well. I relied pretty heavily on my references for this part, especially photographs or scans of old magazines, as that's a good way to get a sense of what colors may have been considered trendy or fashionable at a time where photographs from the period would be in black and white. For me, color is ultimately a process of trial and error. Digital colors have the benefit of letting you pick whatever color you want and to mess around with them freely with ease, but the process of mixing color in traditional mediums can help the colors to feel more harmonious through limitation, and also because you can mix a little bit of the same color into all of your other colors to bring them into harmony together. Technically, in digital art, you can do that with blending layers and other things like that, but I don't really want to have to think about that while I'm doing the initial color picking. For me, I find it easier to think, okay, I want a brown, and put it down on the canvas, and then once I have other colors in play with it, adjust them so that they're easier to find one by one in that way. And I find that it gives me a greater control over the final result. You can see while I'm coloring in his vest, I initially decided I wanted to go with a green, but after thinking about it and coloring in his tie with little stripes in kind of what I imagined might be the university's colors, I thought, well, the green vest kind of clashes, and I think he should look a little bit sharper than that, so I'll change it to a blue. And then in changing the suit the vest, I should say, to be blue, it means that then the brown of his jacket isn't quite the right color, and I go in and I adjust the hue and saturation to make it actually slightly redder, so it also picks up that red from his tie again. And so for me, that's kind of the process of color picking that I end up going through, where I might think, okay, well, I want this to be, purple. And then once I have the other colors in play, I realize, well, this purple just really isn't working. I need to pick something else. Or I can say, I wanted this to be green, but now that I have this other color that I like better, maybe this green isn't working anymore. And that's kind of the process that I go along when I'm laying in flat colors. Now that I have the designs finished, it really should have been time to start playing. I have been using the Solo Investigator's Handbook by Paul Brimler to help guide my play. It offers a bunch of tables and other rules to guide you as you write little journal entries to track what your characters do. Sometimes I just make point form notes, and others I do actually sit down and write things out in the moment. It really just depends, mostly because sometimes I'll play on the bus or on my lunch break, since you can really play wherever if you don't mind using digital dice or typing on your phone. Anyway, I didn't end up launching into playing with these two, nor have I actually named them yet, but instead I wanted to do a little illustration with them. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out in the end. I kind of just went at it without a ton in mind. Other than that, I thought I could use the light from the flashlight to make a circle behind them, even though that doesn't make much sense, and it could be kind of like a frame. And then that with the two of them standing there, I could get a sort of triangular composition overall if they leaned towards each other somewhat. I also decided to lean into the bolder lines I could get with that brush and let my lines be thick and bold. You can probably see where I've gone in and eventually thicken up some of the lines afterwards as well. When inking, I do try to keep some things in mind. First, I try to consider that lines that will be on the bottom of something or will be away from a light source should be thicker to indicate shadow and mass. But having the darker line away from the light source or at the bottom of the object, it really does create a shadow. Even if you go in afterwards and shade in, it just sort of helps accentuate that and adds some visual interest at the same time. The second thing that I try to keep in mind while inking is that it looks pretty good if lines that intersect in a T shape have a bit of extra thickness to them as well, where the line that is intersecting kind of ends up having a bit of a triangular taper as it moves away from the other line. Generally, lines that intersect in that manner tend to be where two objects overlap, so it would naturally have a little bit of extra shadow there. But it's also just kind of a stylized choice for my art that I find adds a little bit of extra visual interest to the line art. I don't always succeed in successfully implementing both of these two techniques, but I do try to think about them consciously while I'm inking, and if I ever feel like something is lacking, I can always go back in afterwards, which I often do on another layer so that I have a little bit more control, and then I can add them in there to really spruce up the inks. Now, moving into color, something happened here. I had a completely different plan for this illustration. I was just going to have that circle in the background as a frame like I talked about, and then a little bit of foreground to emphasize the triangle composition I was going for, but then, I don't know, I had this idea that I could just keep the yellow light on top and then keep the areas outside of the light all blue in shadow. And then I thought about leaving the areas in the yellow circle flat yellow, but that was a bit boring, and then I thought, well, maybe I could color them normal, and they would make the areas outside of the light look like they were in more shadow, but then I thought maybe that would look weird, so I didn't even end up trying it, because that also isn't really how a flashlight works, because if the beam of light from the flashlight is shining at you, it would make it harder for you to see the figures coming towards you, because you would be blinded by the bright light, and then they would be in extreme darkness behind it in comparison. So I ended up trying to give it the same treatment as the shadow areas, but with yellows instead of blues, and I'm so pleased with how it all turned out. I really surprised myself. I think a lot I should experiment with color more, or I should play with color and limited palettes, and I'm so bad at color, my colors are so boring, whatever. So for something like this to turn out the way that it did, I'm ultimately quite proud, and I think that it was a real surprise ultimately, and for it to just kind of happen almost as an accident was a real treat for me personally to see unfold. I think it can be really exciting when you're going about doing something and then it just sort of all turns out in the end. It's definitely something that I'm going to want to try to replicate using similar techniques in different pieces moving forwards. I actually ended up asking a friend of mine if she thought that it looked good or not, because before I, sent it out into the world, I was gripped with this horrible doubt that, oh my god, does it look bad? But maybe I am, maybe I'm delusional and it looks horrible, but I think actually, especially after having, stepped away from it for a little while and gone back to it, really proud of it, and I think it turned out really, really well, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to draw more stuff like this in the future. And hopefully I'll draw some more stuff with these two in the future as well. I'm hoping they won't die horribly while facing off against some of the nastier beasts that exist in the Cthulhu mythos during their campaign, but you never know. Maybe they will. I don't know. Only the dice really know what will happen. Lady Luck will have to see what she has in store for them. But for now, that's all I have to share with you today. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it. And also, if you have any suggestions for what I should name these two, please feel free to leave a comment. I still haven't named them. I really need to do that. But anyway, thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye!